G'day everyone, Jeremy here. Hope you're all well. We've got a couple of minutes before we kick off, so you do still have time to go and grab a glass of water or a quick cup of tea. You're on mute, so if you're enjoying lunch, you can crack on with that without being concerned that we're going to hear you. And if you have a comment or a question as we crack on through this, raise your hand. There's a little hand, you can put your hand up there next to your name, and I'll try and bring you into the conversation. Otherwise, type a note into the chat box. I'm just going to ask just to make sure that we've got technology right. Can you just type yes, you can hear me, and a second yes if you can see my screen. So I'm looking for yes. I'm just going to share my screen now. There we go. So yes, yes, if you can see my screen and if you can hear me reasonably. If you could just type that into the chat box. Thank you. Haven't even got started and Cassandra's put a hand up. So I'm just going to unmute you, Cassandra. And Andrew, can you hear me, Cassandra? Oh, hands down now. Okay. I'll put you back on mute. Perfect. Great. Yeses, thank you from Fiona and Darren. G'day guys. Kate, thank you. Jack, Daniel, Heidi, perfect. G'day Simone, David, Ross, great to see you all online. Thank you for joining us. So we'll get underway. It occurred to me, speaking to a few of you this month, that we did a session a couple ago, I think it was in April, on decision making and decisionship and how to, I guess, disseminate between the major, medium and minor decisions. But a couple of you have asked in discussion in this month, perhaps to extend that a little further and to explore processes that can support decision making within families. A couple of you have within Slack sort of said, well, what processes can we put in place to help us make more effective decisions as a farm business family? And it just is such a great question. And so I'm really keen that we get to explore this today and extend this topic. And as I say, if you've got comments or questions, type them into the chat box. I'll bring you into the conversation when I can. And ideally, if I can throughout, I might unmute some of you, and we can hear some first-hand case studies perhaps. But right now, to kick us off, what I'd like for you to do is to reflect on how well you feel your family makes business management decisions now, and give yourself a rating out of 10. I'm just going to let you have a bit of a discussion at your end of this webinar and just take a moment to try and identify a score. Don't read into it too much. If one of you is giving it a 4 and the other one an 8, maybe put both those scores down. That's fine, or agree to a middle ground. But I'm just keen to understand, when it comes to effective business management decision making in your business and with your family, what do you rate yourselves out of 10? Excellent. So some scores coming through. 7, Daniel, thank you. 6 to 10, thank you. 8 from Kate, great. I'm getting a lot better. Definitely moved from a 3 to a 7 over the past 6 months. That's awesome, Jack. I'm really keen to hear more about what you've done, perhaps. Maybe there's some insights there for the rest of us. Simone, 6, good. Cassandra, 7. Heidi, 7. Perfect. Okay, so it's great. I mean, they're really good scores. I was expecting that there might be some others. Thank you, Fiona and Darren. 8, perfect. So I'm going to launch in by saying, firstly, such an important topic. I was chatting to one of our clients just 2 days ago, and it became really clear to me two things. Firstly, an acknowledgement that we are all different. In a family business, there are so many different shapes and sizes, so many different views and opinions. And I think the first thing we've got to do is to make sure that we're accepting of that, and importantly, that, as I touched on in a prior conversation, that we just check in and, where I do have frustration around decisions made, am I making people right or wrong? It's really important as we get into this that we're not overly critical or laying blame toward other members of our family or making them wrong, perhaps just because they're different. And we might touch on that a little bit more, but being accepting of the fact that there is real diversity within our family is really important. Secondly, in order to succeed as a team, as any team, really, you have to have diversity. If we all looked and thought and played exactly the same, we just wouldn't get anywhere. And I certainly think about the farm owners team. We've got wonderful diversity within our team, and we sort of look for that. And I think the quality of the critical conversations and the quality of the decision making is a result of that diversity. And I just want to remind us of a couple of other concepts, is that if you are giving yourself a 2 or a 3 or a 4 in this at the moment, it's probably because we're caught up in the content, in the busyness. And so I just want to speak briefly again. Great, I'm glad you've got audio back again at your end, Fiona and Darren. Let me know if that continues to play up. And guys, you can dial in if needed, so let us know. I just want to remind us of content versus context, and just go back over this briefly, is that without the glass, with the image that's on the screen, we've got a mess, and it's all over the table or all over the floor. And most of us, where we haven't taken time to set the context of our business or set a method by which to make family decisions, we're spending our whole time trying to contain the mess. Yet if we can go to work to set a context for decision making as a family, and getting some structure to that and some rigor to that and a method and some processes around that, then we create a context. And what we'll find is that the mess will be contained. Everything just finds its own level, and we get to operate at a far higher and more effective level. Perfect. And also with that, a reminder that where there are inefficiencies, breakdowns, and problems, it has been proven by Deming that 94% of the time there is a systems correction to that problem. Even those really heated, acute inter-family debates where we focus often on the other person, be it the son frustrated with the father, or the mother, or the brother frustrated by the sister, whatever it is, 94% of the time there is a systems correction. And so I was speaking to one of our clients the other day, and 20 minutes into that conversation, and there was a lot of animosity, a lot of frustration, and I get it, guys. I get how frustrating it can be at times. It became very evident to me as an outsider looking in, is that the system or the artifact or the document that was missing was simply a lease agreement between the son and the father, where the father was wanting to step back and move away from active decision making, and there'd been an arrangement set up. The one thing that was missing, that if they had in place, was a really clear structure to the terms of operating between the younger generation and the older generation, that might have driven out a whole lot of unnecessary confusion and drama. And so for me, that could have been achieved either in a heads of agreement for that family or even within a lease agreement for that family. And so with that suggestion, we're a way to put that in place, and perhaps we'll report back on the degree to which that systems correction can drive out a good chunk of the frustration and drama and people problems that exist. So what I'm looking at in this is perhaps the architecture that can support strong decision making, more so than focusing on the behavioural stuff and the interpersonal and communication dynamic, if that makes sense. Because what I believe too is once you get a system in place, a strategic adjustment can just make a massive step in shifting the context. So that way, all the people playing in a team, we get to make right. Go, look, there's nothing wrong with you, but what I've identified is that we need this systems correction or this new piece around how we operate, and let's see what impact that can have. And so jumping straight in, I've reflected on this question, and feel free to write these down as we go. What I encourage people to do first and foremost is to fix the problem that is. So many people can focus intently on putting 3 or 4 problems in a pot and confusing issues when what we really need to do is to boil down to what is the problem or what is the decision that needs to be made today. And sometimes chunking down a problem or chunking down a decision can be really important. And with that, and we'll touch on this a little later, is this a major, medium, or minor decision? And we touched on that in decisionship and decision making in a prior conversation. But if it's a minor decision, I would like for employees or junior members of your team to be empowered to make the minor decisions so that as the senior member of the team, you get real leverage. And even with medium level decisions, that some of those, a good chunk of those, are made by your operating team. Again, so that you're leveraged, and that the major decisions come to formal management meetings, which we'll speak about lately. So firstly, it's really important to identify and get on paper, I think, what is the problem? The question that I think most people miss, it's almost because we are the business owners, we presume that it's our decision to make. And so if I'm the patriarch or the matriarch in the family and I've got kids coming through, I might make this mistake, that it's my decision to make. And this is where an infrastructure, an organizational chart, and I'll show you how we do this within farm owners shortly, we can make this mistake where we think all the minor, medium, and major decisions are mine to make. And for me, that is the first significant problem that the senior members of a farming family make. Imagine if, as the chief, husband and wife, senior member of the family team, your arms were tied and you couldn't make decisions, or something happened that meant you were away from the business. Let's say you were in hospital and you just had to leave it up to your son, daughter-in-law, or whoever else is part of your family unit. The first question you might ask from that hospital bed, if you couldn't do it, would be, whose decision is this? Who can I engage to make that decision for me? Because I can't do that at the moment. And this is the question that entrepreneurs and really high-performing CEOs, I believe, get. And they ask it all the time, and they don't wait until they can't make a decision, like the hospital bed example, before they delegate the decision. They ask this all the time. Whose decision is this? Who have I empowered to make this decision? And I'm going to talk about org chart and chain of command shortly, and we'll come back to this one. But I think the first big mistake we make is we presume that the decisions to be made are all on us to make. The third one is, does this need approval prior to actioning? And again, I'll come back to these. But the minor decisions, I would say no, you just want to be updated weekly on how it's going. But absolutely, there'll be some major decisions, like I think we should move from 70% cropping to 50% cropping. That's a management level conversation. And any decision around that, if, for example, the son or the daughter are responsible for the cropping enterprise, would need to be made at a management meeting with approval sought. If it doesn't need approval, then it's go, go, go. Just keep communicating back. But if it is, yes, this does need approval, then this is where the annual, quarterly, monthly, weekly discipline of meetings comes to the fore. And this is why we recommend it so strongly. Is once you've got a 10-year vision, 3-year goal, 1-year goal, and a quarterly plan, and you're into the rhythm with quarterly meetings and then monthly meetings, if there is a need for approval around a problem or a decision, that can just roll into the next management meeting. And so as CEO at the Farm Owners Academy, there are 3 decisions right now I feel empowered to make without needing to go and get Greg and Robbo's decision. But there are 2 decisions that I have on my list to raise with them when we next convene for our monthly meeting. Now, I don't need to interrupt them in the here and now. It doesn't need a special meeting because they're not critical or urgent as problems or decisions, but they will be questions that I will seek clarification and buy-in to when I next arrive to our monthly management meeting. And where we do have a quarterly plan in place within our VTO, then the question becomes, does this change our plan? Or does it need one of its own? Or can we just get on and empower one of our team members to act? Does this change our budget? Because if it does, that needs to be communicated to management. And then we get down to what resources will this need? Does this change our production schedule? And what reporting is required? How do we feed back? I'm going to go back into these in a bit of detail shortly. I just wanted to get across them all. But I guess there's 2 parts to this. Firstly, the annual, quarterly, monthly, weekly planning and communication framework is foundational to strong decision process within families. It's normal practice outside family business within law firms, accounting firms, financial planning businesses and others, and those businesses that implement that absolutely get greater alignment and greater cohesion and more effective outcomes around decisions than those that don't. And then overlaying over that is making sure that this sequence is followed. So any questions at this stage? Just going to look for a moment for hands and see how we're going. Seem okay. So I'm just going to keep going. And what I'm going to do is just put that off to the side. And I just want to show you how we do it, because I think best practice outside family business is so important when applied back to a family business. The principles, I believe, apply. And so just using farm owners as an example, just stick with me a second while I set this up. Okay. Here's our org chart. And I think you may have seen this before, but we've got Greg as COO, I'm CEO, Adele is Business Practice or Implementation Manager, and then we've got Sales and Marketing, Community, Operations, Admin, and Finance. And then within Operations, we have FFF and Take Control, Platinum Mastermind, and you'll see that Adele has 4 functions within our org chart. This is what I'm wanting for you to achieve in any org chart that you set up, because I believe this is pivotal. I've just done this with a large piggery here in my area with a team of 60. And when I arrived to them, they were making committee-based decisions, and there was no real clarity, though people had titles, there was no real clarity around decision process and reporting lines. And there was relative confusion because the 2 owners of the business were getting involved in every decision from the ground up to the major ones. And that was confusing the management hierarchy that had been engaged to oversee and effectively run the piggery. And so in a farming business, I would have the 2 owners, and I would probably nominate one of you to be the head of operations, one of you to be the head of finance, one of you to be the head of admin. They might be the same people. One of you to be the head of marketing, and then OH&S, work health and safety, HR might be another one. And then under operations, like we do here with Adele, I absolutely would encourage you to nominate someone to be responsible for each of the enterprises. I think where we start to come unstuck is that we don't have anyone owning the cropping program or anyone owning the wool enterprise or the cattle enterprise. And I think where we've got father, son, daughter-in-law, or any combination thereof, all thinking that they are part of the leadership of that enterprise, that's where the problems, I think, can come up. And so there was a farming family next door to us where I grew up at Yerong Creek, and they did it this way. They had 3 sons, 3 very active daughter-in-laws, and mum and dad on the farm, and they were actively leasing country and buying country in order to scale up to be able to support all of those families. And so they said, righto, well, for 3 years, you're responsible for cropping, Bill. Peter, you're responsible for the meat sheep, and Alan, you're responsible for the wool sheep. And so they gave an enterprise to each of the sons, and after 3 years, they rotated. So effectively over a 9-year period, everyone got to be responsible for the 3 key enterprises, and Rob, the father, just wanted to be responsible for the prime lambs, the prime stud, the stud that was the 4th enterprise. And so that's how they created their org chart, and the way that they created a bit of cross enterprise learning over the course of 9 years is to rotate the roles, which I thought was quite clever. And so in this business for us now, there's probably 4 staff members at least who could manage the finances of the business. But we believe Greg's strongest at that for obvious reasons, and that's with him at the moment. It's not saying that it will be with him forever, but I guess back on you guys, that just because there might be 2 or 3 members of your team who could competently run the cropping program, It doesn't mean that you all need to. It's far more efficient if one of you is allocated to overseeing the leadership of that department or that enterprise, so that that frees up the other members of the family to focus on other things. But I think at this level, it's really important that we get clear on who is responsible for what and who is the delegated authority that ultimately the performance of the cropping program rests with, or the performance of the financial department rests with. And this is where, when we go through the VTO training, is that we talk about building an org chart for 3 years from now, when this business is done. It needs to be this expanded, if you like. So at the moment, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 members of our team, before we include Westy and Cheryl as coaches and Tracy as head coach. But our top team, so up here, yet there's 10 or 12 boxes. So it's about breaking your org chart down to functional areas. So we did this for this piggery that I've spoken about, but the thing that really made it work is then thinking about this like it was a train system, where the boxes are the stations and the lines in between them are like the train lines that exist between, for me, it's Wagga and Cootamundra, for example, or Keith and Adelaide. Yeah, so if we think about it, if I've got a problem with something to do with how coaching's happening, as CEO, I can't just divert down and speak to Cheryl and Westy about that if I'm being true to the chain of command in this org chart. So what I need to do is identify that I've observed a problem, or I've got a question. I need to put that to the head of operations in Adele, and then head it down to whoever is responsible for the Platinum Mastermind program. I'll just take the names out. So if the CEO has a problem or a question or would like a change made, we've got to follow chain of command. So we need to engage operations head and then the head of the program, and then it's up to the head of that program to engage the coaches in order to effect that change or to answer that problem. So this is where, over on the left, where I say, what is the problem? That's why it's really important to be accurate around that. And then whose decision is this? In this structure, 90% of the decisions should be made by people sitting under the implementation manager. And I'll explain that further. But this is the question that I think is critical to ask, is whose decision is this? On our org chart, if Bill is responsible for the cropping program, and I've got concern that we're doing wheat on wheat too often based on what the agronomist said the other day, then I might, rather than have that conversation on the fly or ring the agronomist and make that change as the farm owner, I've got to instead honour the chain of command within the org chart that we have. And at the appropriate time, I think, at the monthly meeting, after a report has been provided by Bill in relation to the cropping plan for the year, and there are decisions like that being made right now, that's the opportunity for the senior member of the family perhaps to ask the question in a constructive manner. Bill, have you thought about ryegrass resistance and the concept of growing wheat on wheat a third year in a row in those paddocks? I want to be clear that I have concern around that. But that's respecting that the decision is Bill's to make, because he's head of the cropping enterprise, and it's asking a question at the appropriate time, in the appropriate setting, and in the appropriate way. So again, if under operations, the 3 sons in that example all had an enterprise each, then I would want them empowered that any decisions that relate to those enterprises are their decision to make according to this chain of command. And then it's about getting clear on, with regard to the cropping enterprise, does it need approval prior to actioning? And I would think in that example, absolutely. If Bill is empowered to go and meet with the agronomist and drive around the paddocks and set the cropping program this year, I would suggest that that cropping program absolutely has to come back to one of the monthly meetings. It's probably the one in March or April as we get set for the break. And that cropping program needs every family member's signature on the front cover, and the bill needs approval from everyone in the org chart that it is sound. That's due process. But that is far more effective, I think, than 4 family members and the agronomist driving around necessarily, all trying to make decisions about what goes in each paddock together, which for me is kind of the example of not having a structure like this. So I'm just going to check for questions. Just hang on while I bring that back up. So I can't see any hands up at this stage. Please put questions in if you have them, guys. I'll keep going. So this is where the org chart, I think, in answering this question, is the place to start, but unpacking the org chart into all of the functional areas. Who's responsible for capital purchases? Who's responsible for management of grain storage, feed conservation? Who's responsible for machinery maintenance? Your org chart can be unpacked at that level. Okay. Then once we've done that, and we've got people responsible for various enterprises and various functions, it absolutely comes back to, is this a minor, medium, or major decision? If it's what chemical to use to knock over that weed in that cropping rotation, and do we graze a paddock for weeds coming out of summer versus spraying it, I would argue that that is Bill's decision to make. And if I want to challenge Bill on his decisions, again, that might be the monthly meeting. If it's urgent, save it for the weekly meeting. But do it in the right context and in the right way. Or send an email, perhaps, asking, can we discuss this at our weekly meeting? I've got concern about this. Again, it's doing it in the right way and at the appropriate time. But if it's a relatively minor decision, do we graze the weeds coming out of summer versus spray them? That's Bill's decision to make. If it's do we change our strategy from 60% cropping to 40% cropping because the outlook for meat production is favorable? I would suggest that's an annual planning or a quarterly meeting at a minimum, but certainly an annual planning meeting. And that's a major. And so with minor decisions, as CEO, I try and empower people to make the minor decisions and don't tell me. I don't need to know. Simple example is we're out of ink cartridges, go and buy them. I mean, that's a really simplistic example, but a medium decision, what I try and empower people within my org chart to do is to make those decisions on the run. Tell me after you've implemented them. Give me an update at the end of the month. So for example, often Adele has to do a whole host of research in order to find an appropriate venue for our top producer programs and deep dives. I want her to feel completely empowered to own that project. And at the end of the month, when we arrive to our monthly team meetings, that she updates us on her research and her recommendation. And she just asks for us to sign off on her recommendation. The major decisions are back with Greg and Robbo and I to make, either with or without the team. And as for this tree example, there's millions of minor decisions to make. There's 15, maybe medium level decisions. There's only ever 2 or 3 real major decisions to make in a given year. The major decisions largely should be done proactively and annually. The medium decisions can be put in a plan, made quarterly and put into an action plan, which we'll get to. The minor decisions just need to happen, and people within your team need to feel empowered to make those without needing to call on you for approval or sign off. So it's kind of annual, quarterly, weekly, or monthly and weekly. So just going one step further into this, the next level obviously is to capture that in duty statements so that people understand what they are empowered to do and responsible for. So there's my duty statement, if you like. I'm responsible for these things: marketing, operations, finance. We've got in here the frequency of our attention to those. Greg's, Adele's, Robbo as marketing manager. It's a bigger role than that, but we've just condensed it right down. Kobe as admin assistant, Westy as community manager, and our coaches. So that supports our org chart. And then we go over to the production schedule for you. I like this document, that we've then condensed this into an admin plan. So for every functional area in our business, we've got a bit of a sequence here going that talks about when those actions need to be taken or when those events happen. And we look at this monthly and make sure that we're attending to every component. And for me, this is the level of detail that I think a good farm production plan could get to. When are the key admin functions needed to take place? And getting down into your operations, which is kind of the coaching component, you could have all the different milestone events, joining, weaning, crutching, shearing, feeding, etc., scheduled in with someone responsible for those and when they're going to happen according to the org chart. I'd love to see a production system getting down to this, and that's where, when you've got that level of granularity and a decision pops up, you can quickly say, does this impact our plan? Does this impact our budget? Does this impact our production schedule? And if so, you can come in here, make necessary adjustments and move on as a cohesive and aligned team. So that's the structure that supports the chain of command. But where it all comes unstuck, just coming back to the org chart, in my experience, is when the boss heads down here into operations or into enterprise and gets involved and undermines the delegated authority. So it's a bit like if someone's empowered in the org chart to be responsible for machinery maintenance, and they go ahead and order supplies and they choose a type of oil that the boss, the owner, doesn't like, and the owner comes on in and makes that person wrong for that, then that's breaking chain of command. And it's probably giving feedback at an inappropriate time and often in an inappropriate way. So what I will say just before I sort of check questions is that this structure can be a huge change for the older generation if it is being introduced by the younger generation. And so we've got to be really respectful that it's often that the older generation has run it as a business without the need for a structure like this until now. And so introducing this, doing the design of this is really important, but then we've got to be really delicate in how we introduce this into farming families. Okay, so Kate, a question from you. How do you approach an org chart that has one person filling in a lot of roles due to other people's skills or interests not wanting to fill those roles? Great question. I would, again, think out 3 years, Kate, where it might be how it is now. And I can relate to that is in that I guarantee Farm Owners Academy 3 or 4 years ago might have had an org chart like this, but Adele and Robbo's names would probably have been, and Greg's would have been in every slot. And it might be that in a small business, it's often the case. You know, you think about a plumbing company that has the goal of having a team of 15, but at the moment they've got a team of 3. The boss's name is in effectively 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 of the boxes. That's okay. But what we want to do, what I have done as part of strategic planning with businesses like that, is we then put a number in the top right of each of these boxes as to when we can afford it. Who do we recruit first, and then second, and then third, and then fourth? You know, it might be that we bring in a bookkeeper first, and then we bring in someone to do admin, and then we employ a wool enterprise, like a farm hand to look after the wool enterprise. So I just put it down how it is now, and that's just how it needs to be. But if we think out 3 years, we over that time can build this out to be very different. And if we are patient with those family members that are coming on this journey with us, and we put this in front of them at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way, over time they will put their hand up, I predict, and be willing to carry a larger portion of the load. I think do the exercise, Kate, would be my advice. And then, yeah, at the appropriate planning meeting, put that up. And I think just the visual of that would inspire most family members to look at increasing their level of involvement and level of engagement if it presented like it wasn't equitable and balanced when they saw it. I hope that answers your question. Daniel and Kylie, realizing this example is relevant to your business, would you have a template for this extensive layout that we could use? Absolutely. I've been thinking about this as we've been going through this, Daniel and Kylie. I think I might jump off this call and create an org chart that I think could underpin a typical farming business, maybe with 3 enterprises, and put that up on Slack just so that you've got a starting point on which to build. Very happy to do that. Roger and Karen, looks like a grazing chart. Absolutely, yeah, a grazing chart or a production schedule, absolutely. Thanks, Roger. So moving on, guys, the next part is your quarterly plan. If you can block out time as a family to sit down and design what are the goals and priorities and projects for this next quarter, and do that in an extended meeting, I find most breakdowns within a team or a family unit happen because we haven't just spent enough time proactively planning, and so we're operating in chaos and in a reactive mode. If we can sit down and create a quarterly action plan like the one within the VTO, So we've got the VTO one and then we expand on it. So we identify the actions within the VTO and then expand that as needed. Then as we roll into the new quarter, we've got all of our projects listed. We've got our goals really clear up the top. The orange here are all the projects that we need to focus on this quarter. It's exactly what needs to happen, who's responsible for that action, and when it needs to be done by. Now, green is complete, so we're making good progress. And what we've done, if I just expand out to the right here, we've broken the quarter down into fortnights. And so this sort of gives us a visual. If I just make that a little bit smaller, stick with me a second. This gives us a visual on what needs to happen and when. So basically here we are rolling into this fortnight now. I can at a glance look down and look at, we should be on top of all of these priorities by now, and I'm confident that we are. Yep, we've launched that. This just hasn't quite been updated this week. But here's the priorities now. We've got a lot of work to do in these projects down here, but at a glance I can get a sense of where we're up to and set up the weekly meeting and appropriate preparations for the monthly meetings accordingly. So any new problem or decision that comes in, that's where the question is, does this change our plan? Because if this is locked in at the start of the quarter, then it's locked in. And very little should deviate or have us need to adapt this plan. In a farming context, if the season comes in early or comes in later, for me that influences the production schedule or the farm operations plan that we talked about before. It shouldn't necessarily impact, I guess, the quarterly plan that you have as a business. So just in addition, and in terms of supporting strong decision making within families, there are these three documents we've touched on in prior sessions, and certainly within the Top Producer program, you will get to a point where we direct you on how to establish the core values of your company. These are ours. Without these, largely when it comes to complex decision making, we're flying blind a little bit. But if we can take time as families to determine what are the core values underpinning this team and what does that mean, then that can support strong decision making, because in the heat of a debate around a specific problem in the appropriate setting, we can defer back to our core values and make a decision in that context. So in addition to core values, what we have is a company standard on how we will conduct ourselves with external customers, internal customers, how we will pursue results, and general. And that's all part of our induction. So there's a really strong set of company standards. And there's also a service standard, because we're in the service business. Here's how we will aim to conduct ourselves when supporting and dealing with customers. It just gives us a reference and helps us build out that context, so that if anyone at any time isn't being disciplined or diligent or demonstrating enough responsibility, then this gives me something to go back to. So that's how it's done, or we do it within farm owners. Now, if we turn our attention to a family context, again, what I want to encourage you to do is to stay true to getting the annual quarterly, monthly and weekly meeting architecture in place as first priority. Second to that then is building out that org chart for 3 years from now. And then the chain of command piece around that becomes really important, is getting everyone within the family to appreciate that Jane or Sarah are responsible for the cattle and Bill's responsible for the cropping, and Amanda is responsible for the wool sheep, and that they are different functions from the chief's function potentially. And then how do we make decisions around that is a really constructive conversation to have. But where I see a huge amount of problems coming up is when we create the org chart and we don't follow chain of command. So the next part for me is within a management meeting. Once all that's in place, a few more questions. I'm just going to stop. Okay, Kate, thank you. Perfect, totally agree. Great. I'm glad that answered your question. Daniel and Kylie, also the Excel task spreadsheet, happy to share that, absolutely. Quarterly action plan, yes, absolutely, happy to share those as well. We've got some templates around those, absolutely. So then when we get into the monthly management meeting, and this is a really important conversation, I think the annual meeting, the quarterly meeting and the monthly meetings are just so important. And I guess there needs to be a preset agenda. And again, we've got examples and a recommended format to that. But it's important, this is how proper meetings in professional firms work, is that we arrive to a meeting, there's a preset agenda and reports have been provided prior. So I wouldn't arrive to a meeting with Greg and Robbo without financial reports up to date, without the action plan up to date, and without a written report on where each project is up to and how we're tracking across all the key parts of or functional areas of the business. So there's a marketing report, there's an operations report, there's a sales report, there's a finance report. But they have to be provided to all participants of the meeting, I think 48 hours beforehand. It's just good process. And that way, this turns the meeting on its head. So rather than people arriving to the meeting and seeing information that they agree with or don't agree with for the first time, this gives them a chance to do the pre-work and to arrive instead with a criticism, with a clarifying question. And so if the report can be provided 48 hours before, then on the agenda is Bill, righto, cropping report over to you. And so Bill provides an update on the cropping report and then invites questions, or the chair of that meeting invites questions. And that is the appropriate time in the appropriate meeting for anyone who has a challenge or a frustration or a question in relation to the cropping enterprise to raise that concern in the appropriate way. It's far better done in that moment, in that way, rather than it being at any other time, I think, where there is risk of creating disharmony and conflict. So in a normal process, questions are invited. If there is a difference of opinion, that's acknowledged by whoever it is that is the chair or the facilitator of the meeting. It is important to remind people that, guys, we've got a difference of opinion. Let's have a discussion around it, but let's just remember that this is Bill's decision ultimately to make if we are to honour the chain of command. So let's have a discussion. We invite difference of opinion. We invite challenge. So let's have a healthy discussion around that. But let's remember that at the end of the day, we're going to give that discussion back to Bill, and it's his discussion, his decision to make. And this is where I talked before about breaking down the problem. We can ask these two questions. Is this a now or a later thing? Do we need to have this discussion today, or can we all think on this and we come back and have either a special meeting or we raise this at next month's meeting? Does this need to go on the agenda for next month? Because often we're having heated discussions around decisions that don't need to be made right now. So if you can take the emotion out of the situation by pushing that decision back to another formal setting, that's okay. But then equally, point 6, it's really important. This is where I talk about focusing on the problem that is looking at getting everyone aligned to what actually has to be achieved today in relation to this. So if someone arrives to this management meeting and Bill presents the production report or the intended rotation for the year following a meeting with the agronomist, and someone thinks we should be 60% sheep, not 60% cropping, I would say, look, that's a great point. If I was the facilitator or chair, would everyone agree we're kind of too far into this season now to make that change at this stage? Would you be okay if at the end of this year, when we arrive to our annual planning meeting, that there's some budgets and some analysis done around that, and that we arrive to next year's planning meeting and ask the question, should we be 60% cropping or 60% livestock? But that doesn't need to necessarily be a decision for today. Then once we've identified what needs to be addressed today, whose decision ultimately it is, then absolutely let's invite an open forum discussion around that. And at the end of that discussion, a good chairman, a good CEO, a good facilitator will go, righto, Bill, you've heard the narrative, it's back on you. And then Bill gets to nominate, well, I think we'll make this decision now, let's move on, or Bill might elect to take that discussion away, reflect on it, and take on a different course of action. Just going to check for questions. David. Absolutely. I think your question is, can I make the company's and service standards available? Happy to, absolutely. Lastly, guys, in this, within that context or outside of it, there may well be disagreement. And within farming families and within any business family, it's common and normal. But this is where, for me, if we have these structures in place and there is disagreement about the operations or the management of the business between the meetings, then a cracking way to diffuse that argument in the paddock is just to say, hey, let's park this and bring it up at the management meeting. And if we know that the management meeting is on the 15th of the month, then whoever's responsible for the agenda of that meeting gets an email or a note saying, hey, please put this matter on the agenda for this meeting. And that person slots it in as general business or slots it into the cropping as a general discussion item, after Bill's cropping report or whatever. But if we can take those heated disagreements and make them constructive issues and feed them into the appropriate meeting at the appropriate time, that's how we take drama and risk of misalignment or lack of cohesion out of high-performing teams. But where there's disagreement, if we can do that, then we can arrive to the monthly or the quarterly meeting. Just encourage you that when you do, to lean in, be respectful, constructive, professional, so that we're looking at it, looking for the systems correction and we're looking for a constructive solution rather than making someone wrong or laying blame, as we spoke about before. And then just encourage the chair and the facilitator and everyone involved in that discussion to honour the org chart and honour the chain of command that sits within and behind that org chart. And even if the org chart's up on the wall, that can help, and the values are up on the wall, that can help make this, help us navigate disagreement so much more strongly. And then the last one, and this is the hard one I think often for families, is to leave the meeting in the room. So, you know, an acknowledgement that decisions and discussions that are made in the meeting stay in the room so that we can get on and enjoy a family barbecue tomorrow afternoon, leaving this matter in the professional setting of the meeting. In my experience, I'm saying 96, that's what Deming found, but I do believe that most family business decisions can be resolved with good structure, systems, due process, and good governance. And then for the 4% that can't, and in closing, this is where it can absolutely pay to have, if there is consistent challenge and constant disagreement within monthly meetings or quarterly meetings or annual planning meetings, this is where I encourage you to do one of three things. One is to seek external support. Have a third party like a Tony Cat or someone like that, or your accountant, or if they're good, or a local farm consultant to facilitate and chair your monthly or quarterly or annual meetings, just to try and bring this structure to life in support of all involved. The other option you've got is to empower the CEO or the managing director where there is disagreement between, let's say that the guy responsible for the wool enterprise wants more sheep, the person responsible for the cropping wants more crop. If that can't be agreed between them, you can either get an external support in, or you can empower the CEO or managing director to make the overriding decision. But again, once that decision is made by that person within that org chart and that hierarchy, that just has to be respected for this year. Where there's good governance. And again, what happens in normal, perhaps non-family or other professional settings is the other thing we've got, and I was part of a directorship of 7 up until a year ago or 18 months ago. Absolutely, there was a strong shareholder agreement or partnership agreement that if there's really strong disagreement between family members, that's where it can be really handy to have a partnership agreement in place that says, hey, if we just can't work it out, then, and we need to vote or we need to defer to a formal dispute resolution or mediation situation, then having a partnership agreement that outlines how those sorts of decisions are made when there is real conflict is really handy. In that directorship where I was the newest and the 7th director, I brought my business into this business and away we went. There was really clear voting protocols if things got to that, but the absolute intent was that that document never get pulled out of the cupboard, and it never needed to. So it's good to have that as a fallback for the really strong disagreements or disputes or really sort of significant conflict, and that might happen. But the goal is always to resolve those through good due process like that I've outlined. Cool. In finishing, just want to go back to a statement I made earlier that as the boss, it's not up to you to make all the decisions, quite the opposite. So when someone comes to you with a problem or raises an issue,
I'd love for you to sort of help them determine what the issue is, and then explore the concept based on my org chart and on the chain of command, who is empowered to make this decision. Don't presume that it's you. That way you can let them lead and grow and enjoy the process of formalizing the decision structure within a growing family. So to those of you with multiple members of your team being family and looking just to shape more structure around how you make effective decisions together, I hope this has been helpful. The refreshing thing for me is that it is just good due business process. That's our best go-to tactic. There isn't necessarily anything else that I would recommend that we try and put in place just because we're family. I think let's learn from what best practice is outside family business and bring those disciplines in, as we've spoken about, to support good decision making within our families. So I'm happy to tweak and share those documents as requested. I'll put those up on Slack shortly. I'll just take some of the detail out so that they're empty documents for you to call on. Keep working through the top producer modules and programs. A lot of this does get covered as you move through it. But again, for those of you that have asked these questions and raised this for this session, I just want to say thank you. A really important topic. And I hope, welcome your feedback, but I hope I've covered that well and give you, I guess, the responses and the direction that you are looking for. So just before I wrap up, any final questions? Please just type them in. Okay, that being the case, guys, all the best as you get crops in and get this new season underway. It's fantastic to see a good general rain. I hope that's arrived to you. And I hope the season already is favourable for you. It's wonderful that most commodity prices remain strong, and that for most it's business as usual given the pandemic as it plays out. Keep in touch. Thank you, guys. Appreciate that feedback, Fiona and Darren. Thanks, Daniel. Take care, guys. All the best, and bye for now.